In your article, you suggested that schools have only a limited influence on closing the achievement gap between students who live in poverty and their more affluent peers unless school improvement is combined with broader and social and economic reforms. What type of other social and economic reforms were you talking about?
Well, the major causes of low achievement of disadvantaged children uh, are the economic and social conditions with which they come to school. And these economic and social disadvantages are numerous. I can give you a few examples. One, for example, to take a simple one, is that children living in low-income urban neighborhoods have a much higher rate than children who live in middle-class neighborhoods, simply because the pollution is greater in urban neighborhoods and the environmental conditions generally, the vermin, the lack of cleanup in the neighborhood induces much more asthma than living in a more healthy environment. Well, children who have asthma are awake at night. If they come to school, they're more drowsy, they're absent more often. If you take two groups of children who are equal in every respect, except that one group of children is absent more often because of asthma or is drowsy in school, the group of children with asthma is going to achieve at lower levels on average than the children who don't have that level of asthma. And we know that African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle class white children.
Wow.
So what I was saying was that there are many, many conditions like this that affect children living in low-income urban neighborhoods. And when you add them up all together, they explain a good part of the achievement gap. And there's nothing that schools can do to eliminate these causes. A good teacher can spend more time giving special attention to a child who's drowsy than a child who's not. But a good teacher can't completely overcome this disadvantage or any of the many other disadvantages with which children come to school.
Now, in your article, you stated, and I quote, educators have a special and unique insight into the damage that deprivation does to children's learning potential. End quote. Could you please explain what you meant by this statement?
Well, building on what I said a minute ago, most people who are not in schools, and most middle-class people, don't have day-to-day contact with disadvantaged children, and so they don't appreciate these problems. But a teacher in an urban school, particularly in a minority school in a segregated neighborhood, sees children every day who come to school drowsy because of asthma. They see children every day who can't pay attention because they are hungry. They see children every day who are traumatized because of violence in the neighborhood. All of these things contribute to their low achievement, and teachers are very much aware of this. So they have no trouble understanding that they're being asked to overcome conditions which have no causes in the school itself and which can't be overcome by schools themselves.
What else has your years of experience told you about children that are striving to do well academically, but first have to come to grips with poverty?
Well, I think the main lesson that I've learned is that despite everything I've said about the disadvantages that children, low-income children, and particularly African American children in low-income neighborhoods come to school with. If a child comes to school stressed because of violence in the neighborhood, because of a parental unemployment shock, a teacher in an integrated school can give that child special attention and try to overcome the stress that the child is coming to school with. But if you take children like that and concentrate them in schools where every child has one or another or many of these kinds of disadvantages, it's impossible to give special attention to every child.
Sure.
So all the problems that I've been describing are exacerbated by segregation. When you concentrate children in schools with disadvantages, the impediments to high achievement are increased. So the first step we need to take in order to address these kinds of problems is to do a more aggressive job in integrating schools. And unfortunately, we can't integrate schools unless we integrate neighborhoods, because most children who go to segregated schools go to those schools because they're living in segregated neighborhoods. So segregation is a central part of this problem that's separate from the individual social and economic disadvantages with which children come to school.
Now, excuse me, you mentioned, you know, these African American children, minorities, living in segregated neighborhoods, and they're subpar and they're going to subpar schools because of one reason or the other. Of course, one of the reasons being that their parents are unemployed or underemployed. Uh, I want to know, does job spatial mismatch play a role in families' abilities to stay in or out of poverty? Please explain.
Well, one of the reasons that the conditions of some low-income minority neighborhoods have deteriorated over the last few generations and have concentrated children with disadvantages so heavily in those neighborhoods is because jobs that used to exist in those neighborhoods have disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
First, they fled to the suburbs. Many of them have fled overseas. And whereas you used to have segregated neighborhoods which were had a full class structure. You had middle class African Americans, lower class African Americans, people with good jobs, people with bad jobs, all living in the same neighborhood. Now we have a situation where inner city or urban neighborhoods are concentrated poverty. Middle class African Americans have been able to leave, frequently to segregated middle class African American neighborhoods, but they've been able to leave, leaving the conditions in those neighborhoods much worse than they used to be. And so the disappearance of jobs in those neighborhoods is critical. We do not provide adequate transportation for families in those neighborhoods to get to jobs in the suburbs, and we have not provided ways of desegregating the residences themselves so that families can live in neighborhoods where there are jobs. So you're right, that's a very, very important part of this problem.
In your opinion, is the fix to this problem a matter of the right policy? Please explain.
Well, there are many fixes to this problem, but we have shown very little ability or interest in implementing the fixes. I just mentioned one. We could provide adequate public transportation from urban neighborhoods where minority families are concentrated. We could provide adequate transportation from those neighborhoods to suburban neighborhoods where jobs exist. We don't do it. We could implement policies that would desegregate those neighborhoods. For example, we presently have a program run by the U.S. Department of the Treasury in which tax credits are given to developers to build low and moderate income housing. Those tax credits are used almost exclusively to build housing in already segregated neighborhoods because the land is cheaper, because there's less opposition from middle-class families to having low-income families in their midst. We could very easily prohibit developers from taking those tax credits and using them to construct more housing for low-income families in already low-income neighborhoods, and require that they be placed in high-opportunity neighborhoods and middle-class neighborhoods. So there are many policies that we could pursue to address this problem, but we have had little interest in pursuing them.
What is your opinion, about private citizens or communities getting together and developing their own programs that will provide much needed skills these children need in order to be successful academically despite their impoverished condition?
The most important things we can do to improve their achievement and give them the skills that they need is to improve the economic and social conditions in which they live. Schools are not the problem. They're not the main problem. There are some very bad schools in urban neighborhoods. There are some very good ones, and there are some very bad schools in middle-class neighborhoods and some very good ones. The primary reason for the low achievement and disadvantaged children is not because schools are not giving them the skills they need, because they're coming to school with an inability to take advantage of that instruction because of enormous social and economic impediments to their learning.